Go for it.
So, after that, animation, this time, models. You got the opening act, whatever. So I'm John. I currently work at Mutual Omaha. We're in Omaha. Before then, I've been there since October. Before then, I've worked at Hay Needle for a couple years. And then prior to that, I worked at a company that started off as E1 Commerce and then changed to Micros Retail, and now it's part of Cisco. You know, they had an e-com engine. I've been working front end dev for, what is that now? That's 8 years or so. E-com mostly. Now I'm working in insurance and figuring myself out with that. But that's just a quick introduction to you. What I'm really here to talk about is models. Specifically, I'm going to talk Angular. So who doesn't know Angular? Okay. Who doesn't know what Angular is, period? Like, how far back do I need to go? Do you want me to give you the quick rundown, or are you familiar enough with Angular?
Familiar.
All right, okay. And we know MVC, all of that, grant. Okay, so what is a model? I'm just going to start with that. Wikipedia says a lot of words. That's exciting. An article that I read on this is actually, this is my favorite quote as to what a model is. Model lives on a server. And I like to even say even further, model's a database. That's a model. I mean, you know, you can get more complex than that, obviously, but that's a good mindset to have. Jared Santo gave a presentation at NebraskaJS Omaha, back before it was Omaha, and on Angular. And let's see, I don't know if I've got sound. Let's find out if I have sound. Nope.
Main control has a model value of Jared, user of Jared. And so Angular models are different than what you may think of, like a model class. Like if you're doing a traditional MVC, where like the model has all this built-in functionality, you usually inherit from it, right? And it gives you a bunch of stuff for free and requires a bunch of stuff from you as well. Angular is very ignorant about models. It doesn't care very much. It's just JavaScript objects, okay? So I just gave it a name and I gave it a value and it says, okay, in the scope, user is Jared.
So, the point is Angular, the database, you've got, your getter setters and everything else like that. Angular doesn't care how your model looks. It just says this is a model and it goes with it. In fact, it's not even a model so much as just an object. And you call it a model, and that makes it a model. So it's, So what? The nice thing about the Angular model is it's flexible but mutable. And one of the problems with an Angular model is that it's flexible but it's mutable. It's super simple to set up. It's an object. It's super simple to change. But just like everything else, anytime something's super simple, it's super simple to screw up. It's just like anything with JavaScript, it's, you can change a number to a string or what have you, and if you don't account for that, everything breaks and everybody cries. Well, the same thing with your model. You can easily change something in your model and then it screws something up further on. Tightly coupled. A lot of times when you're building out an Angular application, what you do is you put an object in your controller, and that's your model. And if you want to access that model in another controller, you have to nest your second controller in the first controller, and so on and so forth. And you can set up different scopes and everything. So it's tightly coupled, and then tight coupling tends to beget more tight coupling. And it's not too big on efficiencies. You don't have, your controllers get really cluttered because you have your getters and setters in your controllers, if that's where you put your model data. Sometimes you'll have multiple requests on the same resource. If you don't actually check to see that you have that resource in your model, you may just go ahead and fire another AJAX request and get it. Again, that's the easy way to do it. There's nothing preventing you from doing that. you know, so on and so forth. It's just, you know, it's what you want to make of it, but there's, you know, some problems with that. So one thing you can do to kind of give a little bit more discipline to your model is, instead of putting it in the controller and just kind of doing the Wild West of models, use an Angular service to hold on to your model data. This gives you a few benefits. One, it's decoupled from the controller. Your service is, in Angular, a service is a singleton. So pretend it's like a database table. You know, there's only one username table, first name, last name, whatever your data is. Well, there's one username service. So it's decoupled from the controller. That means that your getter and setter methods are directly, you can put them in the service, so they're directly tied to the model. They're not cluttering your controller. You're not, you know, having to worry about if you bring this model into another controller in another part of your app. You don't have to bring those getters and setters and put them in your controller as well. You don't have to duplicate that code. It's all in the service. You can use data across controllers without nesting the controllers. You can set the data on the service through one controller, and then this other completely unrelated controller can access that data. So that's the other thing it gives you some greater efficiencies. You can maintain a list of resources within the service, and it doesn't, so you don't necessarily, you can check to see if I already got this resource, give me that resource. You don't have to go out and fetch more, fetch it a second time. And you can also keep a copy of the original data if you've got like a form and you start manipulating some of that data, and then you want to reset that data. You can keep in like a hidden variable, a private variable, and then when you reset, you just copy that private variable back into to whatever you had as you were manipulating. You don't have to, again, it just prevents you from having to go out and refetch the data. Just a little bit more efficiency. And it, again, offers cleaner code. If you haven't heard me say it enough, it pulls stuff out of your controller. So your methods, your properties, they all related to the one model, stay with the one model. And you can easily port that model to other controllers within the same app, to other apps. There are some problems. Just a few of them. One thing, it's super simple to want to put everything in the service. So you have a model where you have first name and last name as separate properties, and you want to put in a method that says, all right, give me the full name, and it just ties those two strings together. Build a filter for that. That doesn't need to be in the service. If you're going to use a service as a model, I would recommend that you keep it as close to like a database-like construct as possible. Just make it data, setters and getters, and if you need to, any other sort of, you know, manipulation to make that model look like the model you want it to be, but not necessarily, you know, methods to manipulate the model data. That's for controllers. Porting. You can keep a list of all the resources that you pull down in a session, which means that you can keep all the resources you pull down in a session, and that can grow. So you need to be careful about that. If you're going to do this and you want to keep state data, some sort of data state, make sure that you don't go overboard with that. And finally, I mean, there's more problems in this. These are the three that I'm going to point out. Not everything is a nail. You know, that if you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Not everything needs to be put in the service. You've got a flag on your scope. You want to say something's active or not, just throw that in the controller if it makes sense. You don't need to have everything. And this also kind of goes up to put all the things in the service. You don't need to have full name in the service. You can create a filter. You could just template it out to show first name, last name. You could do something in the controller, whatever makes sense, but it doesn't need to be in the service, so don't go overboard with that. With that, we'll go into some really contrived examples. So here is the app. How does that look? Is that readable? Are we good? Yeah. Okay. So just to have something to do with, I hooked into GitHub, and basically what I do is I use 2 GitHub usernames, pull down all the users they follow, and if they follow the same person, I display that person. So 2 GitHub usernames.
The Lark in.
The Larkin. Is that with the hyphen or something?
2 N's. INN.
Ah. And?
J Thramer. JTHRAMER.
All right, let's see. Hey, look at you. This works. Great. So, it works.
I'll look.
You actually, well, my code works, but also you guys, all right, so the Larkin, Kramer, they both follow time stretch. This just shows that it works. It's not exciting. So I'll show you the code. So basically,
Bigger. Make the code bigger.
yep, just a minute.
Okay.
Better, is that, you know what? Better effort. Let's see if we can get a better color scheme. I don't know what it is going to be. That classic. Show pretty well? Okay. So, let's see. In the form, on submit, we fire the get user info method. We've got user form blue and red, and that gets passed to that method. And then here we just show the users that we enter, blue and red. For colors, users and users. Show red corner, blue corner, the login, avatar, and just a count of how many people you're following. And then share follows. If you have anything, if you guys are sharing a follow, which we are, fortunately, share, it tells you how many, and then it just lists through the users you're following. On the controller side, we bring in the HTTP, nothing interesting. So get user is basically goes out to the GitHub, so that's our getter, goes out to the GitHub API and pulls back the user info via JSON-P and assigns it to scope users label. The scope method, which is exposed to the form. Where is it? Yeah, get user info, get user red and blue. So that's how that works. It calls this function, and once the data comes back and gets assigned to the user, then it goes and calls this get following, which is right here, which is again just another call out to GitHub API, pulls down the following list, and then concatenates and then adds that to the user object as user follow. Then is following is it's basically that's a filter function. You go through, say, red's array of follows, and you say, okay, does blue follow this person? That's all that does, and then if it does, it just collates it into an array and returns the array. And that gets called here in figure shared, which I attached to the scope but didn't need to. So ignore that. But that's all it does. It checks to see if everything is populated. Fun and exciting and all sorts of fun things. So that is, again, so we're seeing a lot of getters, setters, and controller. We're seeing just, controller is a lot of lines of code, but it works. So now what we're going to do, now that I gave you sort of a setup of that code, we'll look at what we change. We'll start with, first I create this better models, which is just a place to, the actual where I instantiate the app, I created this better model services, which we'll get to in a minute. Well, we'll get to now. So I made
created this file, githubs.js. And in it, we've got a factory called GHUser. It's got get user, which should look familiar. Get following, which also should look pretty familiar. And then it returns as a factory, so it's like a, for non-Angular people, it's basically a constructor function. It returns an object that has those methods applied attached to it. If you supply a login, it will go out and fetch the user information right away. Otherwise, you can always do that with the get method, and it returns that. And so if we look at our controller file, we'll see that whoop, I cannot make that bigger. All right, so you'll see that we don't okay. You'll see that I didn't take out the is following function. We'll ignore that for a bit. I bring in get GHUser as a dependency of the controller. I set users as just a simple, which we did in the other one. In the get user info function, which still needs to be exposed because that's what the form on submit, that's what gets called. But you'll see here now that this is a lot cleaner. This is just simply call GHUser and then whatever the login that gets passed to it, and that gets assigned to your model variables. So that just cut out a whole bunch of code. That basically, is all the setters and getters are now getting used in the service, and that's all we have to do to call for that. And then the figure shared is still in there. And then I set up to do figure shared. We've got a watch that makes so when the user red and user blue model data gets changed, the watch will trigger and figure out whether or not the data is loaded, if the data has loaded for both objects, if they share any users. And we go here. Is it
J framer.
Huh?
J framer.
J. That's right. Still works. That's really not going to change from one state to the other. So we're going to go one step further though. This is it, and then we'll be done with the dry looking at code stuff. Okay. Look at that. Yeah. Okay. So here on main. Okay, yeah, so here on main, you'll notice that we've cleaned up this controller a lot. Right now, we bring in users to compare, and we set scope users equals users to compare dot users, and get user info just calls get users on users to compare, but we haven't looked at get users to compare. So get users to compare. User. Yes, users to compare. Users to compare is a new service that we created down here. Brings in the GitHub user factory that we messed with in the last one. This .users, it just sets a default users object, and then it has a method that if you call get users, it just calls new GHUser in red and sets those users. So what we've done here is, prior to this in the controller, we had we still had sort of like a getter setter thing going on, because the form then had to set that users object in the controller. The users object was still hosted in the controller. It was built in the controller. You set those. Now we've just got one function that gets that you pass both logins to. So the form basically goes straight to this function, which we saw in the other controller. So now your whole object model object is basically held right here. So what that allows us to do further, what I did here is, I made a new controller called shared follows controller, and I took all the comparing the two follow list functions and put them in here. What that allowed us to do is, you'll notice here, just real quick. Here, get users controller now encompasses the form, and it'll show the two users. And that's what this div does. And then outside of that controller, whereas before it was all part of the same controller, outside of that controller, this is going to look at the same service, so it's going to look at the same data, but it doesn't have to be part of that controller. It's pretty contrived examples, but just to show it works. And then, so it pulls the data from that same thing. That's the purpose of showing that. And as we will see, I'll take my debugs out. And it works. I was going to show another example, the edit user example, but I wasn't able to get that working, so I apologize for that. I was going to try and show how you can keep the original data in a private variable and but things. But it's just, so it's not fun. It's not flashy, it's not animation. There's no Scrooge McDuck. But if you start playing with models, they can get pretty hairy. This is a great way to kind of keep them under control. So, real quick, just some further resources, and I'll make sure to get these links out to you so that you can actually see them. The slides.com/yarthur/YARTHUR/building better models is the slide deck. But Jared Santo gave a really great presentation a year and a half ago or so. But it's especially if you haven't played with Angular, it's a good introduction to Angular. Modeling data and state in your AngularJS application. This kind of goes into what we were talking about. The only thing is that in models and services in Angular, Rob Connery's article actually kind of takes this to town and says it's not really that great. Here's what I'll say about these two. I agree with Rob that, because Joel puts state in his model, and I wouldn't necessarily do that. And again, there's nothing wrong with making some models in the controller, depending upon the context. But the one thing I'll take to issue with Rob is Rob kind of complains he wants you to have your database as your model, and that's pragmatically just not going to happen. So that's what I'll say to that. And then finally, and we'll take a look at this real quick, Steven Soika used to work at Haniel. He now works at Ameritrade. He's the one who kind of introduced me, Sean knows him, he's the one who introduced me to this whole concept, and I don't know why you're laughing, but well, that's okay. He's got, this is a GitHub repo, he's got a script that has a lot of, we'll take a look at it right now. It's really pretty fantastic. It offers a lot of methods. If you've got so this would be like if you've got an array of objects as your model, this will give you a lot of methods and hooks into how to using that, and it uses this whole service as your model concept, but it also ties in a lot of, here, real quick. Most array methods are supported in their native form, except a few. So it shows you, just some native methods and some custom methods that it does give you. So it's a little syntactic sugar type of thing for your model list if you want. So it's a great place, and it's also a great place to kind of look and see in a much more sort of sophisticated way how to implement this into your model handling. So I would definitely take a look at that. That's Steel Soika is his GitHub username, and Angular-model list is the script.
what I got. Any questions? Okay.
I noticed that you used factory in some cases when you're building your service and then the dot service call. Can you maybe explain the difference between the two?
So a factory, this is probably not a good explanation, but it works for me. I like to think of a factory as a constructor function. So, just like if you like new person and you have first name, last name as properties that are automatically, and you've got, it inherits all the methods and so on and so forth. So factory to me is, if you've got a repeatable unit of data. So a GitHub user. You can chuck that into a factory. One of the things I would have liked to have gotten into, but didn't because I don't have my head around testing, is testing. I have a feeling, though I cannot confirm, that doing this also makes your tests a lot easier. One of the things you can do is you can set a default model. And if you've got data that you don't always have, say a bio, I don't have a GitHub bio, you could have a default value for that if that's something you would need to account for. A factory would do that for you then. So a factory is just a way to make sure that you have a unit that has the same things, no matter how many of them you have. You'll at least have a baseline of it's a constructor function. Whereas a service, just a straight service, is literally a singleton. A factory is a singleton that produces something else. So I use, again, a factory, I talk way too much, a factory, proof. A factory is for repeatable units of data. Put them through a factory and they'll come out the same, essentially the same package. Whereas the service would be for like all of your repeatable units of data go into an array in a service. Fair?
Yeah.
So getter setters probably go in the factory. So, okay. Clear as mud?
That makes sense.
Nobody's asleep. That's pretty pretty happy with that. All right, guys, thanks a lot.